Former athlete faces his past and discovers but what he never imagined turns into. A former athlete returns to his hometown, carrying the weight of a shattered dream. The injury that ended his career still echoes in his mind, but the real challenge lies ahead. Entangled in a mystery from the past and the responsibility of guiding lost youths, Jack Morgan finds himself in a dilemma that could change everything. Will he be able to face the ghosts that haunt him and find redemption? Prepare for a story of overcoming, sacrifice, and the search for a new purpose. The wind blew cold over the open fields of Canton, Ohio, as Jack Morgan drove through the familiar streets that once were the stage for his youthful dreams. Now, at 34, he was returning home, but the feeling was not one of return, but of failure. The glory days of football had faded like the steam of a cold morning, leaving behind only bitter memories and a persistent pain in his right knee. The town hadn't changed much. The same houses, the same stores, even the faces were mostly the same. But Jack found no comfort in the familiarity. Everything seemed smaller, less vibrant, as if the flame that once lit up his ambitions had gone out, leaving only shadows. He drove slowly, observing the streets that, in his youth, seemed so full of life and promise. Now they seemed like mere echoes of the past. The last time he was here, he was a local hero, the promising young man who would bring the town's name to national stardom. But a cruel injury, suffered during a crucial game in his sophomore year of college, ended it all. The sound of the ligament snapping still echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of how ruthless fate can be. He tried not to think about it, but the pain, both physical and emotional, pursued him like a shadow. Arriving at the old family home, Jack was greeted by silence. The house had been empty since his mother passed away, and now it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. He knew he needed to find direction in his life, but every time he tried, the weight of the past dragged him down, like invisible chains keeping him trapped. That night, sitting in the worn armchair that once belonged to his father, Jack received an unexpected visit. Mr. Henderson, the local school principal, had heard about Jack's return and came with a proposal. The school's youth football team needed a coach. It was a small team, made up of boys who, like Jack in his youth, saw football as a chance to escape the limitations of small-town life. Jack hesitated. He had left football behind, or at least he tried to. But Mr. Henderson was persistent. He spoke of the boys' potential, the lack of resources, and how Jack could make a difference in their lives. Deep down, the principal knew that Jack needed a purpose, something to take his mind off the downward spiral he was caught in. "Think about it, Jack," Mr. Henderson said before leaving. "These boys need someone who understands what it's like to have a dream, and what it's like to lose it." That night, Jack tossed and turned in bed, thinking about the proposal. He knew he couldn't keep living in the past, but the idea of returning to football filled him with anxiety. The memory of his injury was a ghost that haunted him, making it hard to imagine a return to the sport he once loved. However, something in Mr. Henderson's tone made him realize that maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to find some redemption. In the morning, still feeling the weight of indecision, Jack drove to the school. The football field was empty, except for a few birds chirping cheerfully, oblivious to human dramas. As he watched the field, Jack felt a wave of conflicting emotions. This was the same place where he began his journey, where every ounce of hope and every drop of sweat seemed worthwhile. With a deep sigh, he made his decision. Perhaps he couldn't change the past, but he could try to influence the future of those boys. At least that's what he thought. And with that, he walked into the school, ready to accept the challenge that awaited him. The field was silent when Jack arrived for his first day as coach. The morning air was thick, laden with moisture that clung to the freshly cut grass. He watched the horizon, where the trees swayed gently, as if whispering ancient secrets only the earth knew. Jack was uneasy, feeling like a stranger in a place that should have been familiar. The decision to return to that environment, to relive what he had tried so hard to bury, was beginning to weigh on his shoulders. The boys arrived gradually, in small groups, laughing and shoving each other, carefree of the weight of the world Jack carried. They were young, full of energy, and in Jack's eyes, still naive. He saw in them the hope he had once felt, but now everything seemed distant, almost unreachable. In the first practice, Jack tried to keep his distance, fulfilling the role he was given, but without getting more involved than necessary. He didn't want to get attached, didn't want to create bonds that could be painful. However, he soon realized that wouldn't be so easy. The boys needed more than a coach. They needed someone to guide them, someone who understood them. Tyler, a skinny boy with dark eyes, caught Jack's attention from the start. He was different from the others. While his teammates joked and laughed, Tyler kept to himself, his gaze always fixed on the ground or the distant horizon, as if searching for something no one else could see. Jack recognized that look because it was the same one he saw in the mirror every morning. During the first few days, the practices were mechanical. Jack gave instructions, the boys followed, but something was missing. He saw the lack of connection between them and with himself. The enthusiasm Jack expected to find was absent, both in the boys and in himself. It was as if the field was shrouded in a thick fog, and no one could see beyond it. The nights, for Jack, were long and lonely. The empty house offered no comfort, only echoing the thoughts he tried to silence. He wondered if he had made the right choice in accepting Mr. Henderson's proposal. The weight of the past still pressed on his chest, and each passing day made him feel further from finding any meaning in his life. One afternoon, after a particularly tough practice, Jack noticed Tyler sitting alone on the bleachers, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Something about that boy deeply troubled him, an anguish he couldn't ignore. Against what he thought was his own interest, Jack approached. "Tyler," he called, his voice softer than he intended. The boy looked up, surprised, but said nothing. Jack sat beside him, feeling the invisible resistance that separated him from Tyler, a barrier he knew all too well. "You play well, you know? But it seems like your head is somewhere else." Tyler shrugged, a barely perceptible gesture. The silence between them was heavy, laden with what wasn't being said. Jack knew that forcing the boy to talk wouldn't help, so he waited, letting the moment unfold on its own. After what felt like an eternity, Tyler finally murmured, "Sometimes, it's hard, you know, being here." Jack felt a pang in his chest, a pain he recognized. "Yes, I know," he replied, his voice almost a whisper. "Being here can be harder than people imagine." The boy turned his face toward Jack, his eyes filled with a sadness far beyond his years. I don't know what to do." And in that moment, Jack saw himself reflected in Tyler in a way he hadn't expected. He also didn't know what to do, was as lost as the boy beside him. But in those brief seconds, something changed. Jack realized that by trying to help Tyler, perhaps he could find some direction himself. The following days brought a slight change in Jack's behavior. He was still reserved, still battling his own demons, but he began to pay more attention to the boys, especially Tyler. The invisible barrier was still there, but Jack started to see cracks in it, small openings that could be widened if he tried. And without realizing it, Jack began to get more involved. He corrected the boys' posture, taught new tactics, and occasionally shared some stories from his glory days, something he had sworn to himself he would never do. Gradually, the field began to come to life, and Jack noticed that the boys were responding. There was something there, something he hadn't expected to find, a connection. It wasn't just about football. It was about life, about dreams, and about fighting one's own fears. The field, which was beginning to flourish with the energy of the young players, was now the stage for growing tension. Jack felt the weight of what he had taken on, and the silent expectation hanging over him seemed to increase with each practice. The days turned into an intense routine, where every hour was an effort to keep the boys focused and to push away the dark thoughts that stubbornly returned to his mind. The progress Jack thought he had made was fragile. Each small success on the field was followed by a bigger challenge, and increasingly, he realized he was trying to teach the boys something he hadn't mastered himself: how to deal with pain, loss, and the feeling of helplessness in the face of what cannot be controlled. Tyler, in particular, was a constant source of concern. The boy seemed more distant each day, more absorbed in his own thoughts and less present on the field. Jack saw a reflection of himself in Tyler, the same anguish, the same desire to hide from the world. In Tyler, he saw his own past, and it terrified him. He feared that if he couldn't find a way to reach the boy, Tyler might follow a dark path, just as Jack had almost done. The other boys were also beginning to show signs of frustration. The pressure to improve, to stand out, increased as the games approached. They wanted to impress Jack, to prove to him and to themselves that they were capable of winning. But the anxiety was starting to affect everyone's performance. Conversations between them were less lively, and smiles became rare. Jack saw all this and felt powerless, as if he was losing control. One day, after a particularly difficult practice, where basic mistakes were made and patience was running thin, Jack snapped. "You're giving up before you even start," he shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. The boys looked at him in shock, some with fear. "Do you think the world is going to give you something for free? Do you think you can just complain and everything will get better? Life doesn't work that way." The silence that followed was absolute. The boys seemed to shrink before Jack, and he immediately regretted losing his temper. But the anger at them, at himself, was boiling inside him. He turned away, walking to the edge of the field, trying to control his breathing, trying not to let his emotions overwhelm him. He wasn't just the coach. He was in a constant internal battle, and at that moment he felt like he was losing. Tyler, with clenched fists, was the only one who approached. Maybe you think we're giving up because you've already given up, Jack," he murmured, his voice low but firm enough to reach Jack. The impact of Tyler's words was like a punch to the gut. Jack slowly turned, facing the boy who, for the first time, didn't look away. "What are you talking about, Tyler?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice controlled, but feeling the weight of what the boy had insinuated. "Do you think we don't see it? That we don't notice? You're here, but you're not really here. How can you expect us to do our best if you don't even believe in it?" Tyler shook his head, frustration overflowing in his words. "I don't know what you're dealing with, but we have our struggles too. And if you're not willing to fight for us, then maybe it's time to stop." Those words pierced Jack like sharp blades. He had never imagined that his own internal conflict was affecting the boys so much. Jack, who always thought he was protecting them by keeping his distance, realized that he was actually pushing them further away. In the days that followed, Jack couldn't shake Tyler's words from his mind. He tried to return to practices as if nothing had happened, but the boys were different, more withdrawn, more distant. Jack knew there was a break in trust, something he himself had caused. Tyler, who had once been just a reflection of his own pain, was now becoming a brutal mirror of his own failure. One afternoon, as the boys dispersed after another disastrous practice, Jack remained on the field, sitting on the bench, watching the horizon begin to darken. The silence around him was crushing. He needed to find a way to repair what had been broken, not just with the boys, but within himself. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a small spark of hope, as if the challenge was exactly what he needed to rebuild himself. In that moment, Jack decided he wouldn't leave the boys alone. He stood up with renewed determination, aware that the road ahead would be difficult but also essential for him. It was more than just coaching a team. It was about fighting for something that truly mattered. The cold of the morning intensified as the season advanced. But on the football field, the atmosphere was even more frigid. The practices had become a daily battle against doubt, both in the boys and in Jack. He knew he had to regain the players' trust, but that was proving to be a much harder task than he had imagined. The fragile bond that was beginning to form was broken, and Jack felt the distance between him and the boys grow with each passing day. That week, Jack decided to change his approach. Instead of rigid, silent practices, he began sharing more of his own story, something he had avoided from the start. It wasn't easy for him, but he knew he needed to pave the way for reconnection. The stories of his past glories, the challenges he faced, and the scars he carried brought a new tone to the field. The boys began to listen more attentively, not just to the tactics and strategies, but to the life Jack had lived. These conversations created a new dynamic, transforming the heavy atmosphere into something more intimate and personal. But the turning point came from an unexpected source. One cold morning, while Jack was searching through the old school files for player performance records, he found something he didn't expect. A letter, old and yellowed with time, tucked between dusty documents. The envelope addressed to him bore the seal of a prestigious university. Jack felt a chill recognizing the handwriting of his old coach, Mr. Warren. With trembling hands, Jack opened the letter. The words written there were like a direct blow to his heart. Mr. Warren described the admiration he had for Jack, mentioning how he was in the process of securing a scholarship that could have changed Jack's life. The scholarship was practically guaranteed, a golden opportunity Jack never knew existed. But something was wrong. The letter mentioned a detail Jack couldn't comprehend. Mr. Warren referred to a negative response that Jack had never given. The university had requested a final confirmation of interest, but according to the letter, the response they received was a no. A no that Jack had never sent. Feeling a growing weight in his chest, Jack revisited the events of that time. He remembered how everything fell apart quickly after the injury, but he never knew this opportunity existed, let alone that it had supposedly been refused. A wave of anger and frustration washed over him. Something was wrong, something that didn't make sense, and Jack was determined to find the truth. With the letter in hand, Jack began seeking answers. He visited old colleagues, dredged up painful memories, and gradually, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. A name, a face he preferred to forget, emerged from his past. Mitch Thompson, the teammate who had always been excessively competitive, but whom Jack never considered a real threat. Following the trail of memories, Jack discovered that Mitch, in an act of betrayal, had intercepted the university's correspondence, forging a false response in Jack's name, thus sabotaging his great opportunity. The discovery shook him deeply. The injury was already a big enough blow, but knowing that someone he trusted had destroyed his career out of sheer envy was almost unbearable. Jack felt the anger boiling inside him, an anger he had kept repressed for a long time. But along with the anger came an unexpected clarity. He finally understood why so many aspects of his life had gone wrong. Now everything made sense. With this new knowledge, Jack returned to the field the next day with renewed determination, but also with a moral dilemma that consumed him. He could expose Mitch, reveal the truth, and finally clear his name. But that would mean reopening old wounds, both for himself and for others. And more importantly, how would that affect the boys he was coaching? The last thing he wanted was for his personal battle to hinder their future. The practices continued with a different intensity. Jack, though still shaken, began channeling his frustration into motivating the boys. He was becoming more than just a coach. He was a living example of overcoming, even if they didn't yet know the full extent of the story. Tyler, in particular, began to show signs of change. The boy, who had once kept to himself, now gravitated more toward Jack, not with questions, but with a presence that indicated he was paying attention, that something in the two had aligned in an invisible way. The climax of this internal and external tension came when, in one of the final practices before the decisive game of the season, Mitch Thompson appeared on the field. Now an influential man in the town, Mitch offered Jack a proposal. He would finance the entire team, providing resources the boys had never had, but there was a condition. Jack had to let the past stay buried, had to keep the betrayal a secret, and move on as if nothing had happened. Jack looked at Mitch, and for the first time, he saw the man for who he really was. Not just a traitor, but someone willing to continue manipulating others' destinies for his own benefit. The moral dilemma Jack faced now was overwhelming. He knew how much the money would help the team, but he also knew that accepting it would mean sacrificing his integrity, something he had fought so hard to regain. With Mitch's proposal echoing in his mind, Jack found himself in the middle of the field, surrounded by the boys he had come to see almost as his own sons. The tension that dominated the last few days seemed to have condensed into a single choice. Jack knew that any decision he made would be irreversible. He had spent the night awake, Mitch's words echoing in his mind, mixed with the painful memories of his youth. The proposal was tempting. After all, accepting the money would mean securing an opportunity that those boys would otherwise never have. But at what cost? The next morning, Jack arrived at the field earlier than usual. The sun was just rising over the horizon, painting the sky a deep orange. He sat in the bleachers, the same ones he had occupied so many times as a player, watching the empty field before him. Here, he wasn't just the coach, but the young man full of dreams who once believed the world was at his feet. And here, too, he was the man who lost everything, not just because of a cruel injury, but because of the betrayal of someone who should have been his ally. When the boys began to arrive, Jack felt the weight of the moment. Tyler was the first to approach, his gaze filled with uncertainty. Something in the boy's eyes made Jack think of himself, of how he felt when his own world collapsed. Tyler, who had always been reserved and distant, now seemed to be looking for something in Jack, maybe guidance, a certainty that he himself did not possess. "We have an important game tomorrow, Coach," Tyler said, almost as a question, as if wanting to make sure Jack was still with them, committed. Jack nodded slowly, trying to hide the internal storm raging within him. "Yes, we do, Tyler. And we need to be ready. More than that, we need to be together. All of us." That day's practices were different. There was an intensity in the air, an energy that seemed to vibrate on the field. Jack, even with a heavy heart, led the boys with a determination that surprised even himself. He knew it was now or never. This game, this season, meant more than just wins or losses. It was about redemption, about reclaiming something that had been lost long ago. When practice ended, Jack called the boys for a meeting, something he didn't do often. They gathered in a circle, sweaty and exhausted but attentive. Jack knew this was the moment. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice firm but laden with emotion. "Something that goes beyond football, something you need to understand before we step onto that field tomorrow." The boys exchanged glances, surprised by Jack's serious tone. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say. "You know I had a promising career as a player," he continued. "And you know it all ended because of an injury. But what you don't know is that there was more than that. There was a betrayal, a lie that destroyed my chance to move forward. I recently discovered that a teammate, someone I trusted, sabotaged my opportunity to get a scholarship that would have changed my life." The boys' eyes widened, and Jack saw the disbelief and anger growing on their faces. Tyler, in particular, seemed shocked, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "And now that same person has offered me money, a lot of money to fund our team," Jack said, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. "But with one condition, that I leave the past buried, that I forget what happened and move on, as if nothing ever happened." The silence that followed was crushing. The boys looked at Jack, waiting for his decision. And there, in those young eyes, Jack saw the truth. They expected him to be better, to do what was right, even if it was hard. Jack knew he couldn't let them down. "I refused," he declared, with a firmness that even surprised himself. "I won't accept the money. I can't betray my integrity, and I can't betray you. We will fight together with what we have, and win or lose, we'll do it with our heads held high." The impact of his words was immediate. The boys moved closer, surrounding Jack in a collective embrace, as if sharing the same burden. Tyler, silently, was the last to approach. He looked into Jack's eyes, and there, Jack saw something new. Respect, admiration, and perhaps, for the first time, a spark of hope. That night, the community learned of Jack's decision. The news spread quickly, and support came from all sides. Former colleagues, old friends, and even strangers united to help. Small donations began to come in, and soon the team had enough to continue. The community's solidarity showed Jack that sometimes, what is lost can be replaced by something much greater. But the real test was yet to come. The final game of the season was approaching, and the boys were ready to give it their all. Jack knew that this game wouldn't be just another match. It would be the culmination of everything they had learned, of all the internal and external struggles. He was ready to face his past, but also to embrace the future he had helped shape. The day of the final game dawned with a heavy, overcast sky, as if nature itself was undecided about what was to come. The bleachers of the field were more crowded than ever before, with the local community united in support of the youth team, Jack's team. The murmur of conversations and the sound of footsteps created an almost palpable energy in the air. It was a stark contrast to the silence that dominated Jack's mind. The boys were nervous, but there was something different about them. A confidence, a determination that Jack had never seen before. He knew that what they were facing on that field wasn't just another team, but the fears and doubts each of them carried within. Jack, more than anyone, understood the importance of this game. It wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about proving they were capable, that they were worthy. Tyler was especially quiet. Jack watched him from a distance, noticing the tension in the boy, something deeper than simple pre-game nerves. He approached slowly, sensing that this was the moment for the right words, for the support that Tyler might never have received before. "Tyler," Jack called, his voice calm but firm. The boy looked up, meeting his gaze with a mixture of anxiety and determination. "Remember why you're here. You have more strength than you realize. It's not about what happened before, but about what you're going to do now." Tyler nodded slowly, Jack's words echoing in his mind. There was something in that moment, something he couldn't describe, but that made him feel seen, understood. For the first time, he felt that he had someone by his side, someone who truly believed in him. The whistle blew, and the game began with an intensity that made the crowd buzz. The plays were fast, fierce, and it quickly became clear that both teams were willing to give everything to win. Jack watched from the sideline, every movement, every decision, rooting not just for victory, but for the boys' triumph over the fears and doubts that had haunted them. As time passed, the score remained tight, with both teams fighting bravely. But Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. And then, in the middle of a decisive play, what he feared most happened. Tyler, running toward the goal line, was tackled by an opponent in a brutal collision. The field fell silent as Tyler lay motionless on the ground, pain visible on his face. Jack felt the blood freeze in his veins, reliving the moment when his own career had ended so abruptly. Everything seemed to repeat itself, and for a moment, Jack was overwhelmed by despair, by the helplessness he knew so well. But then, something changed within him. He realized that this was the moment, the breaking point where he could do things differently. Instead of being paralyzed by fear, Jack ran toward Tyler, kneeling beside the boy. The crowd watched in silence, anxious. "Tyler, look at me," Jack said, holding the boy's face firmly but with a tenderness that only someone who had been through it could offer. "You're going to be okay. Trust me. Don't give up now." Tyler, gasping with pain, looked at Jack with tears in his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. Jack already understood. The young man was terrified, fearing that this was the end, that his dreams were ending here, just as Jack's had ended years before. But Jack, with renewed conviction, didn't allow the boy to give in to fear. With the help of the medical team, Tyler was carried off the field, and Jack returned to the sideline, feeling a mix of emotions. He knew he had done what he could, but now everything was in the hands of the remaining boys. The game continued, and the team, inspired by Tyler's courage and Jack's unwavering support, fought with all they had. In the final minutes, in a play that seemed impossible, the team achieved what many would consider a miracle. With a series of precise passes and a desperate run, they scored the decisive point. The final whistle blew, and the field erupted in celebration. Jack's team had won against all odds. But for Jack, the true victory wasn't on the scoreboard. It was in the transformation that had occurred within him, in the fact that, for the first time in years, he felt he had overcome the past, that he had found a new purpose. Tyler, though injured, was safe and had a future ahead of him. Jack knew that this boy and all the others would have a better life because he chose to fight alongside them. After the game, Tyler was taken to the hospital to treat his injury, and Jack accompanied him. The hospital, a place Jack had avoided for years, now seemed less threatening. It was a place of healing, not an end. He waited patiently until the doctor emerged with a reassuring smile. Tyler's injury was serious, but he would recover. Jack let out a sigh of relief, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The next day, the community gathered to honor the team and, especially, Jack. During the ceremony, the school principal announced that the football field would be renamed in his honor, a tribute that caught Jack completely by surprise. As he listened to the words of recognition, Jack realized something he had never understood. His true legacy wasn't in trophies or victories, but in the lives he had touched, in the people he had helped shape. Tyler, now with a shy smile on his face, approached Jack after the ceremony. "Coach," he began, his voice still fragile but laden with emotion. "I never had a father around. I always looked for someone I could trust, someone who would be there for me. And you were that person for me." Tyler's words were like a balm to Jack's heart. He knelt before the boy, his eyes moist, and said, "I never had someone like that either, Tyler, but now we have each other, and that's what matters." The field around them seemed brighter, more alive, as if reflecting the new life Jack had found. He knew the road would still be full of challenges, but now, for the first time, he was at peace. Jack had faced his past, and in doing so, discovered that the future was much more promising than he had ever imagined.